She was 3 years old when she became, by some estimates, one of the wealthiest children on earth. She is the only living descendant of one of the richest men who ever lived, and she has spent her entire adult life trying to get rid of almost everything his money built. She sold the private island where her grandfather is buried. She walked away from the legendary yacht, the palaces, the name itself, when she could. She lives quietly now, far from the spotlight, doing the one thing that was ever truly hers, and it has nothing to do with shipping, or oil, or billions. Why would this last heir to the Onassis fortune, a fortune press reports once valued near $2.7 billion, spend her life selling it off, giving it away, and running from the name? What did she see in that inheritance that made her want none of it? This is the story of Athina Onassis, the last of the line. Her great-grandfather fled a burning city with nothing and built an empire on a single belief: that money was the only thing no one could ever take from you. That belief made the family unimaginably rich. It also, one by one, destroyed almost every person who inherited it, and it left the whole of it, finally, to a single orphaned little girl, a grandmother who died at 37, the loneliest rich woman in the world, an uncle dead in the sky at 24, a mother she lost at 3, and a fortune that, by the time it reached Athina, had become less an inheritance than a warning. Watch this not as a story about a billionaire heiress. Watch it as the question her whole family died asking: what is a fortune worth if everyone who holds it ends up alone? And remember one small object, not a jewel, not a deed, but a worn leather pair of riding gloves. We will come back to what she chose to hold instead of the money. To understand why a young woman would give away an empire, you have to begin 2 generations before her, with a 16-year-old boy watching his entire world burn. In September 1922, the great Mediterranean port of Smyrna, then home to a large and prosperous Greek population, was consumed by fire as the Greco-Turkish War reached its catastrophic end. From the deck of a departing ship, a teenager watched the skyline of his birthplace dissolve into smoke. His family had been wealthy tobacco merchants. In a matter of days, the fortune was gone, the city was gone, and the world he had been born into simply ceased to exist. His name was Aristotle Onassis, and the lesson of that burning city would govern every decision of the rest of his life, and shape the fate of everyone who carried his blood. He left as a refugee, traveling on a Nansen passport, the document issued to the stateless, and arrived in Argentina in 1923 with almost nothing. A boy who had been rich, then a refugee, then an immigrant inside a single year. He took night work. He counted every coin. And somewhere in that descent, he reached a conclusion that would become the secret engine of the entire Onassis dynasty. He had learned, at 16, that everything could be taken from you in a single night. Your home, your country, your family's money, your safety. Everything except one thing. A fortune large enough, mobile enough, controlled tightly enough, could never be taken again. Money to Aristotle Onassis was not luxury. It was the only security that existed. It was the only thing on earth that was truly real. We will return at the very end of this story to how completely that belief failed the people he loved. The world would come to know Onassis as a charmer, a seducer, a titan of immense warmth and appetite. But underneath the charm ran the cold arithmetic of the boy on the ship. Love could burn. Countries could burn. People could be lost. Money, properly built, could not. And so he set out to build a fortune so vast it could survive the end of the world. He very nearly did. What he could not build was a family that would survive him. The rise was one of the most spectacular in the history of money. In Argentina, Onassis built a tobacco importing business and made his first fortune by his mid-20s. But he saw something larger. Everything the modern world needed, oil, grain, goods, had to move across water. And the man who owned the ships owned the choke point. In the depths of the Great Depression, when the world's fleets sat idle and freighters could be bought for pennies, Onassis did the opposite of everyone else. He bought. He purchased surplus cargo ships at rock-bottom prices, betting that trade would return. It did, and when it did, he owned the boats. From there he built relentlessly. Into oil tankers, and then into the giant supertankers that would carry the world's petroleum. Into a whaling fleet. Into Olympic Airways, Greece's national carrier. Into a controlling stake in Monte Carlo itself. By the post-war decades, Aristotle Onassis was one of the richest men on the planet, master of one of the largest privately controlled shipping fleets in the world, a stateless refugee who had made statelessness itself into a business strategy. registering ships under flags of convenience and answering to no single nation. And he built a private kingdom to match, the yacht Christina O. A converted warship turned 325-foot floating palace, named for his daughter, with a pool that became a dance floor, and a guest list of presidents and movie stars. The island of Scorpios in the Ionian Sea, bought and landscaped into a personal paradise. The opera diva Maria Callas on his arm, in the most famous love affair in Europe. Hold the name of that island in your mind, Scorpios, remember it. Because it is where this story will, in a sense, both begin and end. It is where the family would be buried. And it is the first thing the last heir would sell. He had 2 children to inherit it all, by his marriage to Tina Livanos, the daughter of a rival shipping dynasty. A son, Alexander, born in 1948, and a daughter, Christina, born in 1950. The empire had its future, the fortune had its heirs, and the boy who watched everything burn had finally built the thing that could not be taken from him. A fortress of money, tall enough to keep out fire, war, revolution, and loss. He had armored himself completely against the world. He had not armored himself against the one thing money cannot touch. And it was coming for his children. Stand on the deck of the Christina O, at the height of the Onassis world, and the glamour is almost blinding. Winston Churchill in a deck chair. Greta Garbo at the rail. Maria Callas at the piano. Kings, presidents, and film stars moving through a floating palace owned by a man who, 40 years earlier, had carried everything he owned off a burning dock. In 1968, Onassis would marry Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American president, the most famous woman in the world. The refugee from Smyrna now had a former First Lady of the United States as his wife. Picture the empire at its peak, the supertankers crossing every ocean, the island paradise, the airline bearing the nation's name, the fortune measured in the hundreds of millions when $1 million was still a fortune. The Onassis name was, around the world, a synonym for wealth without limit. And here is the cruelty hidden inside the triumph. Aristotle Onassis had made himself invulnerable to everything he feared as a boy. He had armored himself, totally, against loss. But he had built that armor by believing money was the only real thing, and that single belief left him, and every child and grandchild who came after, utterly defenseless against the one kind of loss money cannot reach. The empire was at its zenith. The family was about to begin dying. And in less than 2 decades, the whole of it would funnel down to a single 3-year-old girl. Look past the glittering deck, at the 2 children growing up on it, and the crack is already there. Alexander and Christina were raised inside almost unimaginable wealth, and a profound emotional cold. Their parents' marriage curdled into a bitter, public divorce. The children were shuttled between homes, staff, and schools, raised more by nannies than parents. Their father measured the world in deals and dollars, and was often absent. And so the founder's doctrine began passing into the second generation, not as wisdom, but as a wound. The children learned, by the entire shape of their upbringing, that the fortune was the center of the family's universe. That they were, in some sense, appendages of the empire rather than the reason for it. Christina, in particular, would grow up never quite certain whether she was loved for herself or for the $500 million standing behind her. It is the exact uncertainty that would one day reach her own daughter, a little girl not yet born, who would inherit not only the money but the doubt that came welded to it. The fortress was complete. The family inside it was already cracking. Aristotle Onassis had armored his fortune against every disaster he could imagine. War, revolution, bankruptcy, fire. But on a January morning in 1973, a small seaplane lifted off the runway at Athens airport, and within seconds, the one catastrophe the great Onassis had never armored against came screaming down out of the sky. It would kill his son and heir. It would break the founder beyond repair. And it would begin a cascade of deaths so swift and so cruel that within 15 years, the entire dynasty would collapse down to one orphaned child. Her name would be Athina, and she would inherit all of it, and want none of it. By the early 1970s, the Onassis dynasty looked, from the outside, utterly invincible. The fortune was at its height. The fleet ruled the seas. The founder had married a president's widow. The 2 heirs were grown. Alexander, handsome and headstrong, being groomed to one day command the empire. Christina, devoted to her father and desperate for his approval. To the world, this was a family that had won, that had escaped, permanently, the ordinary human fates of loss and grief. And this is where the story lulls you. the yacht, the island, the airline. You look at this family at the summit of the world and you think, surely money on this scale buys a kind of immunity. Surely nothing can reach them up there. It buys nothing of the sort, and the cracks were already spreading beneath the gold. The Jackie Kennedy marriage, dazzling to the world, was a wound to the children who were loyal to their mother and saw the famous American widow as an intruder. The family was fracturing along its emotional fault lines even as the cameras flashed. Aristotle's true heir was Alexander, and Alexander, by accounts, had a difficult, complicated relationship with the father whose empire he was being shaped to inherit. The dynasty had a future, a plan, a crown prince. It had everything. It had, in fact, almost exactly 2 years before the calm shattered into a grief from which the founder would never recover, and from which the family, arguably, never did either. The first to fall would be the one the whole empire was built to be handed to. It was January 22nd, 1973, Athens Airport. Alexander Onassis, 24 years old, the heir to the entire Onassis empire, boarded a small seaplane to oversee a test flight. Seconds after takeoff, the aircraft banked wrongly, lost control and crashed. Alexander suffered catastrophic head injuries. He died the next day. The man who had armored himself against every conceivable loss now sat in a hospital corridor, helpless, as the one thing money could not save slipped away. All the supertankers, all the islands, all the fortune built to be untouchable, none of it could buy back 20 seconds of a January morning. Aristotle Onassis was never the same man again. Watch the founder's entire philosophy collapse in real time. He had spent 50 years proving that enough money makes you invulnerable. His son's death proved, in an instant, that the whole creed was a lie, that the things which actually matter were precisely the things his fortune could never reach. He could not absorb it. He became consumed by grief and paranoia, convinced the crash was sabotage, pouring money into investigations and conspiracies, because he could not accept that the universe had simply taken his son the way it had once taken his city. His health, already failing, collapsed, and the deaths did not stop. In 1974, barely a year later, Christina's mother, Tina, died suddenly in Paris at 45, and in March 1975, Aristotle Onassis himself died, his body broken by grief and illness, less than 2 years after the son whose death he never survived. Count the losses and count the time. In roughly 26 months, Christina Onassis lost her brother, her mother, and her father. By the spring of 1975, she was 24 years old, the same age Alexander had been when he died, and almost everyone who had defined her world was gone. She was the last Onassis standing. The entire empire and the entire weight of the family's grief now fell on her alone. And here is the thread that runs straight to Athena. Christina inherited the fortune. She did not inherit happiness or security or the certainty of being loved. She inherited the founder's doctrine in its cruelest form, unlimited money and the bone-deep suspicion, bred into her since childhood, that the money was the only thing about her anyone had ever truly wanted. She would spend the rest of her short life trying to disprove it. And she would pass that exact wound, intact, to the daughter she had not yet had. To understand Athena, you have to understand the mother she barely knew, because Christina Onassis is the first tragedy, and the warning Athena would spend her life heeding. Christina took control of the shipping empire and threw herself into it. She was now one of the richest women on earth, and she was, by every account, profoundly unhappy, waging a lifelong war against her own body and her own loneliness. Married and divorced 4 times in 17 years, each marriage shadowed by the same unanswerable question, do you love me or do you love the fortune? Her 4th and final marriage, in 1984, was to a French businessman named Thierry Roussel, a man she had loved since her youth. And in January 1985, Roussel gave Christina the one love she would never have to question, a daughter. They named her Athena, after Christina's own mother. By every account, motherhood transformed Christina. Here, at last, was a person whose love was not in doubt, a child who was simply, purely hers. But even that was built on a wound, because throughout the marriage, Roussel was maintaining a parallel life with another woman, the Swedish model Gabi Landhage, with whom he had other children during his marriage to Christina. The great love of Christina's life was leading a double life, and Christina, who had never once been able to trust that she was loved for herself, found her deepest fear confirmed in the most intimate way possible. The marriage collapsed. And on November 19th, 1988, Athina Onassis was found dead in a bathtub in Argentina. The official cause was pulmonary edema. Her heart, weakened by years of crash dieting and chemical strain, had given out. She was 37 years old. Athina was 3. What does a fortune of $500 million actually buy if the woman who holds it dies alone at 37 in a borrowed bathroom, with her only child too young to remember her face? The first tragedy, and the engine of everything Athina would later become. Because the most important inheritance Athina left her daughter was not the money. It was the lesson of her own life, that the Onassis fortune did not protect you, did not free you, did not make you loved. It isolated you. It made you a prize, and it had killed in one way or another every single person who held it before her. A 3-year-old girl could not understand any of that yet, but she would grow up surrounded by the evidence of it, and one day she would draw the only sane conclusion available to her. She would decide she wanted out. To the world, the orphaned Onassis heiress was a fairy tale, the billion-dollar baby, the richest little girl alive, the storybook child of tragedy and treasure. The reality was quieter and stranger. After Athina's death, the 3-year-old Athina was raised not in the Onassis world at all, but by her father, Thierry Roussel, and the very woman whose existence had broken her mother's marriage, Gaby Landage, whom Roussel later married. She grew up in Switzerland, in a deliberately private family, alongside her 3 half-siblings, with the Roussel name and an ordinary Swiss childhood, school, horses, a life kept as far as possible from the glare that had consumed her mother. The world pictured a tiny heiress on a yacht. The truth was a Swedish-Swiss household, a girl who rode horses and went to a local school, and a vast fortune held at arm's length, managed by trustees and by her father until she came of age. And here, a question to circulate that the press could never fully resolve. A question about that fortune, and who was managing it, and on what terms, in the long years before Athina was old enough to ask. It would erupt into the open the moment she turned 18. Because, between a 3-year-old heiress and a multi-million-dollar fortune stand the adults who control it. And not every interest in that room is the child's. For 15 years, Athina Roussel grew up away from the Onassis name, away from the yacht, away from the island, an ordinary girl with an extraordinary inheritance waiting in trust. And then, on January 29th, 2003, she turned 18. The fortune became hers. The trustees' control ended. And almost the first thing the last Onassis did as an adult was turn against the man who had raised her and take the empire into her own hands. To understand the choices Athina Onassis would make as an adult, you have to understand the betrayal she was born into, because she inherited a wound before she ever inherited a dollar. Her mother, Christina, had spent her entire life unable to believe she was loved for herself rather than for the fortune. 4 marriages had each founded on that doubt. And then, in Thierry Roussel, she believed she had finally found the real thing, the man she had loved since youth, the father of her only child. But the marriage was, from early on, shadowed. Roussel maintained a parallel relationship with the Swedish model Gaby Landage throughout, and had children with her during his marriage to Christina. The one love Christina had trusted most completely turned out to carry the same hidden ledger as all the others. She had been right to be afraid her whole life. That was the cruelest part. Her deepest fear was not paranoia, it was prophecy. And here is the inheritance that mattered most, the one no trust fund could hold. When Christina died in 1988, 3-year-old Athina was placed into the care of Thierry Roussel, and in time, of Gaby Landage herself, the very woman whose existence had broken her mother's heart. The child of the betrayed was raised by the woman who had been the instrument of the betrayal. I want to be careful and fair here, because these are living people, and the human truth is more complicated than a villain story. By many accounts, Gaby Landage raised Athina with genuine care, and the Roussel household gave her something the Onassis world never gave Christina: an ordinary, stable, private childhood, away from the yachts and the headlines. That may have been the kindest thing that ever happened to an Onassis heir. And yet the structural fact remains, and it is extraordinary. The last descendant of Aristotle Onassis was raised inside the household of her mother's romantic rival, on the far side of the very betrayal that helped kill her mother. Think of the 2 inheritances sitting side by side over that little girl's head. One was visible and enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars, a shipping empire, a private island, the most famous yacht in the world. The other was invisible and heavier. A family history in which every single person who held the money had been betrayed by love, isolated by wealth, or destroyed by grief. Athina was the sole heir to both. The treasure and the warning came welded together, and the fortune itself was not sitting quietly in a vault. From the moment of Christina's death, an immense sum was held in trust for the child, and around that trust stood adults, a father, advisors, trustees, lawyers, all involved in the management of one of the great private fortunes of Europe across the 15 years before Athina could touch it herself. By multiple press accounts in those years, the arrangements around the fortune, what was spent, what was paid, how Roussel managed and was compensated for his role, became a matter of public dispute and suspicion. Hold the structure of it in your mind, because it is the same structure that haunted every Onassis. A vulnerable person, this time a child, sits atop a vast fortune, surrounded by people whose interest in her cannot be cleanly separated from their interest in the money. It is the exact predicament that made Christina unable to trust a single suitor. Now it had passed to her daughter, in its purest possible form, an orphaned little girl who could not yet even understand that the people around her were also, inevitably, around her billions. She grew up, she rode her horses, she kept out of the spotlight, and she watched, and she learned. And the world waited to see what the last Onassis would do on the day the money finally, fully became hers. She turned 18, and she did something that told you everything about what she had learned. On January 29, 2003, Athina Roussel turned 18, and the entire Onassis fortune, held in trust her whole life, became legally hers. The press reached for staggering numbers. Reports at the time placed the inheritance in the region of well over $1 billion. Some estimates ran as high as $2.7 billion, the figure that has trailed her name ever since. Whatever the precise figure, the reality was simple. An 18-year-old girl in Switzerland had just become one of the wealthiest young women on the planet, the sole heir to one of history's legendary fortunes. Now think about what 18-year-olds usually do with sudden fortunes. They spend, they celebrate, they lean into the identity. Athina did almost the opposite, and the first thing she did revealed the entire shape of her character. She moved to take control of her inheritance out of her father's hands. The relationship between Athina and Thierry Roussel, the man who had raised her, ruptured over the fortune and its management. As she came of age, she replaced the advisors, restructured the control of her wealth, and effectively ended her father's authority over the Onassis money. By the time Vanity Fair profiled her in 2005 under the title The Last Onassis, the break was open and bitter. The heiress and the father who raised her, estranged, with the fortune at the center of the wound. And here is the heartbreaking echo. Christina's life had been defined by the question, does anyone love me, or only my money? Now her daughter, at 18, was living the same question in its most painful form, forced to wonder whether the father who raised her had been guarding her, or guarding her fortune. The Onassis curse was not a ghost. It was a structure, and it reproduced itself with mechanical precision in every generation. The money poisoning, the closest bond available. Athina took the empire into her own hands, and then she began, deliberately, to take it apart. The clearest statement Athina Onassis ever made about her inheritance was not in words. It was a sail, Scorpios. The private Ionian island her grandfather had bought and built into paradise, where the Christina O had anchored. Where Aristotle, Alexander and Christina Onassis were all buried, in the family chapel and graves on its soil, was the spiritual heart of the entire dynasty. It was not just real estate. It was the Onassis necropolis, the place the family had gone to be laid in the ground. To own Scorpios was, in the most literal sense, to be the keeper of the Onassis dead. In 2013, Athina sold it. The island was leased and effectively transferred to Ekaterina Rybolovleva, daughter of a Russian billionaire, in a deal reported at around €117 million. With the family's graves retained and protected, but the island itself passing out of Onassis' hands for the first time since Aristotle bought it. The last Onassis sold the ground her own grandfather, uncle, and mother were buried in. Sit with the enormity of that decision, and resist the easy reading. It is tempting to call it cold, selling the family graves. But look at it through Athina's eyes. Everything that island represented had destroyed the people she came from. Her grandfather built a fortune there that could not save his son. Her uncle's death broke the family there. Her mother's loneliness echoed through those same rooms. Scorpios was not a paradise to Athena. It was a mausoleum of a curse, a beautiful island where her entire bloodline had gone to die unhappy and rich. Selling it was not coldness. It was an exorcism. And this is the turning point of the whole story, the moment the engine of the dynasty reverses. For 3 generations, the Onassis instinct was to acquire, to build the fortress higher, buy the island, the airline, the yacht, the wife, because Muzzy was the only thing that could never be taken. Athena inherited that fortress and began deliberately to dismantle it. She sold the island. She distanced herself from the relics. She showed no interest in commanding a shipping empire. Where her great-grandfather spent his life proving that nothing could be taken from him, his last heir spent hers giving things away. As if she understood in her bones that the fortress had been a prison all along. What does it tell you? When the sole heir to one of history's great fortunes looks at the private island where her family is buried, and her first instinct is to sell it and walk away, it tells you she had read the family ledger to the bottom, and she had decided she would not die the way they did. But the curse was not finished with her yet, because Athena had also, by then, done the one thing every Onassis woman before her had done. She had married. And she had chosen, like her mother before her, a charming man her family distrusted, a marriage her own father refused to attend. And it was about to fail in the most familiar way imaginable. Here is where Athena's story breaks the pattern of every other heir in this collection, because the devastation this time is not a death. The last Onassis is still alive. The devastation is something subtler and, in its way, more haunting. The moment she discovers that even after all her care, all her learning, all her selling and giving away, the family curse came for her too. In 2005, at 20, Athena married Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known as Doda, a Brazilian Olympic show jumper, 16 years her senior. It was on its surface the happiest possible choice. She had fallen in love through the one world that was truly hers, the world of competitive equestrian sport, not the world of yachts and shipping. She had found a man inside her own passion. But watch the echo, because it is almost unbearable. Her father, Thierry Roussel, and her stepmother did not attend the wedding. The family rift over the fortune ran straight through the most important day of her life. Just as Christina's marriages had been shadowed by the family and the money, Athena's wedding was, too. The bride estranged from the father who raised her, the Onassis fortune poisoning the bond once again, exactly 1 generation later. For a decade the marriage held, and Athena built the life she actually wanted. Not as a shipping magnate, but as a professional show jumper, competing internationally, living for the sport, largely out of the tabloids. For a while, it looked as though she had escaped. She had found love inside her own world, and the curse had passed her by. Then in 2016 it arrived. Athena and Doda separated and divorced. The split, by widely reported accounts, followed alleged infidelity on his part. The man she had loved and married, from inside the one world she trusted, was gone. And the separation became a difficult, drawn-out legal and financial affair, ultimately resolved largely in Athena's favor in the European courts. Now stand back and see the whole pattern snap into place. Because this is the devastation. Athena did everything right. She studied her family's fate. She kept out of the spotlight. She refused the empire. She sold the cursed island. She married for love, inside her own passion, as far from the Onassis world as she could get. And still, she ended up where every Onassis woman ends up, betrayed in love, the marriage collapsing, the fortune entangled in the wreckage, paying her way out of a relationship with a man who was no longer hers. The exact shape of her mother's life. The exact shape of her grandmother's. This is the terrible lesson at the heart of Athena's story, and it is darker than any single death. The Onassis curse was never about the island, or the yacht, or any object she could sell. It was about the fortune itself, and a fortune is not something you can fully escape by giving pieces of it away. As long as Athena was worth what she was worth, she would face the same question her mother died asking. Does this person want me, or what I'm worth? She sold Scorpios. She couldn't sell that. No one in her family ever could. What do? When you have watched the money destroy everyone you came from, spent your whole life trying to escape it, and discover that it has reached you, anyway, in the most intimate room of your life? The answer, for Athena, was the only sane one left. If she could not fully escape the fortune, she could at least refuse to let it become her identity. She would not be a magnate. She would not be a socialite. She would not be a tragic heiress waiting for the bathtub. She would be a rider, and she would spend the rest of her life on horseback, as far from the name as a person with that name can possibly get. At the very beginning, I told you that Athina Onassis drew one conclusion from the burning of Smyrna, a secret belief that became the engine of the entire dynasty. Stand now at the end of the bloodline, with its last living member on horseback in a quiet field, and weigh what that belief finally cost. He concluded that money is the only thing no one can ever take from you, the only security, the only thing that is truly real, and he built one of the great fortunes in history to prove it. He was right about everything except the only thing that mattered. He was right that money could survive fire and war and revolution. He proved it, spectacularly. But he was catastrophically wrong that money was therefore the only thing worth having, because the fortune he built to defeat loss could not save his son from a seaplane, could not save his daughter from her loneliness, could not spare his great-granddaughter from being raised by her mother's rival and betrayed by her own husband. The fortress kept out fire and war. It could not keep out grief or solitude or the simple human need to be loved for yourself. And worse, it manufactured the very isolation it was meant to prevent. That was the darkest secret of the House of Onassis. Not a crime, not a scandal, but a belief. A wounded boy decided money was the only real thing and built a family on that foundation, and so every person who inherited the fortune inherited the doubt that came with it. The inability ever to be sure that they, themselves, were the thing being loved. Aristotle armored his descendants against poverty so completely that he left them defenseless against loneliness. He gave them everything money could buy, and in doing so taught them to suspect that money was all they had to offer. What is the use of building a fortune that can survive the end of the world, if it cannot give a single one of your descendants the ordinary, unpurchased certainty of being loved, and if the last of your line spends her life trying to give it away? Athina Onassis understood this, not as a theory, as the very air she breathed, the story written into every grave on the island she sold, and she made a choice none of her ancestors had been able to make. She decided the fortune would not be the center of her life. She would build that center somewhere else, somewhere the money couldn't reach, couldn't poison, couldn't take. She would build it in a stable, on the back of a horse, with a pair of worn leather gloves, and the one thing she had ever earned entirely for herself. After the divorce, Athina Onassis did not retreat into the role the world had always written for her. She did the opposite. She disappeared into the one thing that was entirely her own. She is a professional showjumper, and not a dilettante heiress playing at sport. She competes seriously at the international level, training for hours every day, traveling the European and global circuit, living the disciplined, physical, unglamorous life of a competitive equestrian. She has based herself largely in Belgium and Brazil, far from Greece, far from the shipping world, far from the Onassis stage. She rides under her own name, wins and loses on her own merits, and measures her days not in dividends but in clear rounds and fences cleared. Understand what this actually is, because it is the quiet heart of the whole story. For an Onassis, the most radical act imaginable is to build an identity that money cannot buy and cannot explain. You cannot purchase a clear round over a course of jumps. You cannot inherit the nerve it takes to ride a half-ton animal at speed toward a wall. The horse does not care what you are worth. In a family where every relationship was poisoned by the question, do you want me or my money, Athina found the one arena on earth where the money is irrelevant, where she is judged purely on what she herself can do. Her great-grandfather measured his worth in tonnage and tankages, and the deck of the most famous yacht in the world. His last heir measures hers in a sport where the Onassis billions buy precisely nothing that matters once the gate opens. He built an identity entirely out of what he owned. She built one entirely out of what she can do. It is the exact inverse of the founder's doctrine, and it may be the only fully sane life anyone in this family ever constructed. And notice what she is not. She is not a fixture of the gossip columns. She is not chasing the next marriage to fill a void. She is not, by any public sign, drinking herself toward a bathtub in Argentina. She watched her mother's life with open eyes, and she built something her mother never could, a life with a center that the fortune cannot reach. She had escaped the fate, but there was one more decision, larger than any of these, the decision about the dynasty itself. Athina Onassis is the last of her bloodline, and as far as the public record shows, she has had no children. Think about what that means, sitting at the end of this particular family's story. The Onassis line, Aristotle, Alexander, Christina, Athena, ends with her. There is no Gen 4. The greatest shipping fortune of the 20th century, the empire built from the ashes of Smyrna, the name that meant limitless wealth across the world, has exactly one living heir, and after her, the direct line simply stops. The dynasty does not collapse in scandal or get seized by revolution. It quietly, deliberately runs out. And here I want to be careful, because we cannot read a living woman's private heart, and her choices about family are hers alone and not ours to diagnose. But step back and look at the shape of it, which is undeniable. Every previous Onassis was desperate to continue the line, to produce the heir, to pass the empire on, to make the fortune immortal. Aristotle grieved himself to death over a lost son and heir. Christina named her daughter for her own mother, reaching backward and forward at once, trying to make the family continue. The continuation of the dynasty was, for 3 generations, a kind of sacred obsession. Athena is the first Onassis who appears to feel no such obligation at all. She has shown no interest in being the keeper of the flame, the guardian of the legacy, the mother of the next heir. She sold the island where the dynasty was buried. She gave up the name when she married. She built her life in a foreign sport in a foreign country. Whether by circumstance or by choice, the last Onassis has not done the one thing every Onassis before her felt compelled to do, and so the line ends with the heir who, more than any of them, seemed to understand that the inheritance was not worth passing on. And maybe that is the most merciful thing she could do for a child who does not exist. To not hand down the fortune that killed her uncle's certainty, hollowed out her mother, and reached into her own marriage. To let the curse die with the line. There will be no 4th-generation heir to spend a life wondering whether they are loved or merely valued. Athena is perhaps the first Onassis to break the chain, by simply declining to forge the next link. The money itself has been split, sold and scattered. A large part of the original Onassis fortune lives on, by Aristotle's own design, in the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, named for the lost son, funding hospitals, scholarships and Greek culture, doing more good in the founder's name than the founder ever did in his life. There is a strange justice in that. Half the fortune went to a girl who spent her life trying to give it away. The other half went to a foundation named after a dead young man, and became at last a force for something other than the family's private grief. The empire that was built to be untouchable ended up touching strangers' lives, in a dead heir's name, while its last living heir rode quietly away from all of it. The fortress is empty now, and the last Onassis prefers it that way. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end, and look at what one boy's conclusion on a burning ship finally produced. Aristotle Onassis watched Smyrna burn at 16, and decided money was the only thing that could never be taken from him. He spent 50 years proving it, building an empire of supertankers and islands and the most famous yacht on earth. Alexander, the chosen heir, died in a seaplane at 24. And the fortunes that could survive war and revolution could not buy back 20 seconds of a January morning. Christina inherited the whole empire and the whole wound at 24. Married 4 times searching for a love she could trust, and died in a bathtub at 37. The loneliest rich woman in the world. And Athena, the last of them, inherited it all at 3 years old. Was raised by the woman who broke her mother's marriage, estranged from the father who raised her over the money, betrayed in her own marriage exactly as her mother had been, and finally chose to sell the island, give up the name, ride away into a sport the fortune couldn't touch, and let the bloodline end with her. One cause sits beneath all of it. Not bad luck. Not a supernatural curse. The deepest cause was a belief, a wounded refugee's conviction that money is the only thing that's real, the only security, the only thing worth trusting. That single belief, passed down with the fortune, meant that every person who held it learned to measure love in money, and so could never be sure they were loved at all. The fortune did exactly what it was built to do. It became unbreakable, untouchable, eternal. And in becoming those things, it made every human being who inherited it a little less able to be simply, ordinarily loved. How does the greatest shipping fortune of the century end with its last heir trying to give it away and choosing not to pass it? The same way these stories always end, when a family comes to believe the money is the realest thing about them, and the bravest act left to the final heir is to refuse to believe it too. Be careful with the lesson, because the easy ones are wrong. The lesson is not that money is evil. Aristotle's rise from refugee to titan is one of the genuine epics of the century, and the foundation bearing his son's name does real good in the world. And the lesson is certainly not that Athena is a tragic figure. She may, in the end, be the least tragic person this family ever produced. The one who got out. The villain was never the fortune. It was the belief, the conviction, born on a burning ship, that money is the only thing that's real. Aristotle built a family on that foundation, and it turned every inheritor into a person who could not trust love, because they had been taught, by the entire structure of their lives, that the money was the most valuable thing they owned. Christina believed it, and it killed her. Athena is the first one who looked at the belief itself and decided it was a lie. And that is why she did everything that looks, from the outside, so strange. Selling the island, giving up the name, riding horses into Belgium instead of running an empire, letting the line end. From inside the family's belief system, those choices are madness. You don't throw away the fortress. But Athena had understood something none of them could, that the fortress was the prison, that the only way to win the game her family had been losing for 3 generations was to refuse to play it at all. She could not give back every dollar, but she could refuse to let the dollars be the center. She could build her life out of something they could never buy. This is where the Onassis story stops being a tragedy and becomes, almost, a quiet kind of victory. The curse needed someone who believed in it, and the last Onassis simply stopped believing. There is a boy, somewhere at the start of this story, standing on a ship's deck watching his entire world turn to ash, and deciding, in that fire, that money was the only thing no one could ever take from him again. He was right. He built a fortune that survived everything, and he handed it down through a son who died in the sky, and a daughter who died in a bathtub, until it came to rest on a 3-year-old girl who never asked for any of it. She could have been the next tragedy. The script was written. Her family had performed it 3 times. The lonely heiress, the poisoned marriages, the fortune that buys everything except the thing you actually need. Instead, the last Onassis read that script to the end, and put it down. She sold the island of the dead. She gave up the name, and she chose, instead of an empire, a pair of riding gloves and a horse and a single clear round that no fortune on earth could buy for her. Her great-grandfather spent his life proving that money was the only thing that could never be taken from you. His last heir spent hers proving he was wrong, by walking away from all of it, and keeping the one thing that was only ever hers.